Welcome back. So we're looking at the prison epistles, and they're named the prison epistles because they were written from prison, funnily enough. We're specifically talking about Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. And there's all sorts of debate that goes on over every single one of Paul's letters. And but we're going to start with a basic starting point that these were written by Paul from prison when he was in prison in Rome. Now, we know that Paul was imprisoned at other times. We certainly know he was imprisoned in Philippi, but that was only like an overnight. We also know that he was, as we're going to see, imprisoned in Caesarea and in Rome as well. So there's lots of debate about this, but the basic premise that we'll work with is that it was during Paul's time in Rome when he was imprisoned, somewhere around 60 to 62 AD. I've never been to prison, but I imagine that you've got a lot of time in your hands, and so for Paul, here he is, and sort of taking stock on where he's been, where he wants to go, and he's writing letters probably quite profusely, anyway, we would imagine. And so here we have a sample of some of those letters. So very quickly, let's just sort of recap where we find this in this story in Paul's, in the narrative of Paul's life. We've spent a lot of time looking at the third missionary journey in Romans, we just sort of talked about Romans where Paul wrote the letter to the Romans at the end of his third missionary journey. And at that point, his goal was, he's writing from Corinth, he sends a letter to Romans to say, hey guys, my plan is to come up there, and then from there I'm going to go off to Spain. In the meantime, I need to get back to Jerusalem, because he'd been taking up this offering. If you remember, Paul had been taking up this offering for quite some time now, and it caused a lot of problems in Corinth. If you remember, we talked about the Corinthians, how they had a lot of doubts and they actually accused Paul of stealing the money. Well, he was successful in convincing the Corinthians that he wasn't trying to steal from them, and as we find out in Romans, because Paul wrote Romans from Corinth, and whilst he was in Corinth, he was able to say that the Corinthians, or specifically he says the Achaeans, which is the region that Corinth is part of, that those guys were contributing to the offering. So obviously, Paul has made amends. They've come to realize that he wasn't stealing it from them, and they came and contributed the offering to Paul to give to Jerusalem. So that solved that issue that we talked about in Corinthians. And so now Paul is saying, well, I need to get back to Jerusalem in order to bring that offering to them. Once I've done that, then my plan is to go to Spain, and I'm going to do that as I come through Rome because, hey, I've always wanted to visit you guys. So that's where we find ourselves at the end of the third missionary journey. Paul then, from here, as you can see on the map, he goes from Corinth and he travels back around through Macedonia and then back down through Troas and through Ephesus by way of just almost a final visit. Paul doesn't know, he's getting a bit older by this stage as well, and he doesn't quite know what the future holds. And so as he's going back through these churches, in small part, it's probably just to say goodbye, just to tie up any loose ends, say goodbye, and really just sort of close those doors, not quite knowing what the future holds, but assuming that the next stage of his missionary journey will probably take him to the rest of his life. So this is kind of by way of, the farewell tour as he goes back to Jerusalem. He gets back to Jerusalem, and things don't quite turn out the way that he expected. He is, as we know, arrested. Now, we read all about this. This whole story we kind of see unfolding between Acts 20 right through to Acts 28. So the last good chunk of the book of Acts is dealing with these last days of Paul, these last few years of Paul, in a lot more detail than what we find in the rest of the narrative. So he gets back to Jerusalem, and he's arrested. There's a mob that, that's that Paul guy, because by now he's becoming quite famous. He's well known as this apostate who's out there corrupting synagogues all over the known world. And so now they've finally got him. They trump up all these charges that he's bringing Gentiles into the temple and all this crazy stuff. And finally, they can deal with him. And so they arrest him, and a mob beats him, and it's all pretty bad stuff. He's kept in chains. He's arrested and he's kept under guard. And a report comes out that the Jews in Jerusalem are planning to kill him. They want to bring him out to hear more from him. They make up this story that they want to hear more from him in public. But the plan is to kill him. And this gets back to the Romans. So they say, look, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to send him up to Caesarea, and we're going to just hold him there. Now, why Caesarea? Well, because Caesarea was the capital of the region. It was the capital of Judea. Jerusalem wasn't the capital, at least as far as the Romans were concerned. The Roman governor, like Pilate that we meet in the Gospels, he lives in Caesarea. And so the idea is to send him to the governor and say, look, this guy is something of a troublemaker, and at the very least, his life is under threat, so he's your problem. So give him to the governor, and he's your problem. So he goes to Caesarea, not knowing what's going to happen. He eventually is just held there for 2 years, not because he's under any sort of punishment, but they just don't want to deal with it. It's just one of those cans of worms they just don't want to go near. Until eventually, some of the Jews come up and they say, hey, look, we want to give Paul a trial, but we want to do it in Jerusalem. Back with the Sanhedrin, back with the main council, we want to have a trial for him. And again, there's a plot. They want to kill him. And so they find out about this, and Paul says, no, I am not going back to Jerusalem. I know what's going to happen on the way. So instead, I'm going to appeal to Caesar. And this is one of the privileges that he has as a Roman citizen. We've talked about Paul's Roman citizenship. One of the privileges you have is that if you ever find yourself in a situation where your life is under threat, you can appeal to Caesar, and you can have your case heard by the emperor. And so this is what Paul does. This is a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? Only a citizen has this privilege. And for Paul, this is his ejector seat. This is his, you know what, I'm out of here. And so they go, well, nothing we can do about it. You've made that appeal. You're a Roman citizen. We can't argue with that. So off you go. And so they send him to Rome, where he's held for another 2 years. Now, the thing we have to recognize about the ancient prison system is that there was no prison system. We think about prison today and we think, okay, you commit a crime and you get an X number of years as a punishment. And the idea of that is to reform you. Ideally, is to reform you. That's a new concept. That sort of came out through the Enlightenment era. Because prior to that, prisons were only ever used to hold you until your court case. And then from there, whatever the decision was, but usually it was a capital case, whatever the decision was would be executed that day. And by executed, I mean executed. So Paul is going to make an appeal. He wants to have his case heard by Nero at this point. But in order to do that, it's not like Nero's going to go, hey, what's on today? Oh, we've got nothing on, so let's just have Paul. No, it's going to happen on Nero's terms. So in order for him to have that hearing, he needs to keep himself in Rome until that time should come. Now, in order to do that, he needs to have some sort of support, because there was no prison system to say, well, we're going to feed you and house you and look after you whilst you're here. He had to provide his own support. So if you didn't have your own ability to look after yourself in prison, you're as good as dead. In fact, you're not going to make that appeal because you just simply can't afford to do it. You're just going to have to try your luck with the governor at the time. So Paul is able to go to Rome, not in the way that he wanted to, but he eventually does get to Rome, to where he had just finished writing to. And it's there that he stays for the next 2 years, under house arrest. Now, the fact that he's under house arrest would indicate to us that the Romans saw this as a nothing, low-level, you know what, this is just a silly crime, there's nothing really going on here, we'll just put you under house arrest. But to be under house arrest, Paul would have had to pay for that himself, or somebody would have had to support him in order for that to happen. And we're going to actually see how that plays out in a moment. But he was relatively free. He had a guard with him, but he was free that guests could come and go, that he could write letters. He had a fair level of autonomy. It's only that he was confined to that particular space. Now, the room itself that Paul was in wouldn't have been some lavish hotel. It would have been a very dingy little spot that was the cheapest he could possibly find, probably in the highest, most upper story of a building. And we think, oh, the upper story, the penthouse suites. No, in the ancient world, the top floor was the worst floor because that's the one that had the furthest distance to get any fresh water. There was no sanitation. If you want to go to the toilet, you've got to go all the way outside, right down the stairs. And if there's a fire, which often there was in these dodgy buildings, you're gone. Right? If you're at the bottom floor, you can get out of there. You're at the top. So we're looking at the prison epistles. That's the first one we're going to look at. So that's the cheap spot. Now we're going to have to go back a little bit just to catch up on where this Philippian church came from. Maybe he's got some resources to bring it back himself, but he would at this stage be largely dependent. So Paul founded this church in Philippi during, and this is where we find Philippi again. We've seen this map because if you remember, you can see way back, we found out that the Philippians were supporters of Paul. They continued to be supporters of Paul right the way through his ministry, even when he was in prison in Rome. And so one of the first letters that he writes from prison in Rome is to these Philippians to acknowledge a gift that they've just sent in order to support him while he was in prison. But we'll look at that in the next video. Paul comes to Philippi, and it's the first city that he actually reaches or stays in when he comes into Europe. In fact, when you go there today, Paul arrived in a city called Neapolis, is what it was named back then. It's now named Kavala. Neapolis just means new city. And you can see there's this beautiful sort of gold-plated shrine, which commemorates the Macedonian man calling Paul and saying, come over here and help us over here in Macedonia. So it's quite lovely. Nevertheless, he goes to Philippi. Now, Philippi was an ancient city, as all the Greek cities were. It was a very important city, particularly in the first century, because the city had actually been refounded by Augustus. Now, it had been the staging ground for a couple of civil wars that took place after Caesar was assassinated. It had been refounded by Augustus as what's called a Roman colony. Now, what the Romans used to do is that rather than go in and change the whole structure of existing cities, they would go in instead and build new cities or rebuild old cities that have been dilapidated and turn them into Roman colonies. And what that was effectively a small mini Rome. Roman constitution, Roman architecture. You felt like you're in a mini version of Rome. Corinth was another example of this, of a Roman colony. But what that meant was that this is a city completely loyal to the emperor, because it was the emperor that founded it. It was the emperor that patronized the city. So Philippi is a devoutly Roman city, which is you can see in Acts when they're having this big riot and they're saying, this guy's advocating practices that are unlawful for us Romans. And you're like, you're Macedonians. No, we're Romans. Our priority is our Roman citizenship. So Paul founds a church here in Philippi, and it's actually what we find in prison for the first time. It's only an overnighter, and he'd been severely beaten prior to that. But he'd had some success, and really importantly, what we find out is that this Philippian church, and probably the Thessalonians, but certainly the Philippians, were a church that had made a partnership with Paul very early on in his ministry. So go right back to the year 50 when he was 49 when he first arrived, right back to the early years of his ministry. Paul had made a partnership with the Philippians that they would become primary supporters of his ministry. Now, the Corinthians had offered him support, but they had strings attached to it. They're like, Paul, we'll look after you, but we want something in return. The Philippians were like, well, we'll give you support, and all we expect in return is that you can do the work of the ministry. Completely different attitude to this. And so they became primary supporters of Paul through that time, and they sent support to Paul when he was in Corinth. And Paul says to the Corinthians later on, time and time and time again, these Philippians continued to send me support. So when we find them now we meet them again in Rome, Paul is writing to thank them for their continued support. All these years later on, they're still sending the support. Now that's really significant because if somebody's in prison, you don't want to be associated with them because they're in prison. They're obviously a bad person, right? You don't want to have the shame, share in the shame of being with this convicted criminal. The Philippians, Paul says, are the only ones that maintained their support. Everybody else had abandoned him. The Philippians, however, maintained their support and continued to send support to him, in this case via Epaphras. So they'd heard Paul was in prison. They'd send him a gift, and they'd send it along with Epaphroditus to be the messenger, as a representative of the Philippians, carrying the offering, coming along to Rome. But then something went wrong. Epaphroditus didn't return. Now, it's been whatever period, we don't know, but apparently Epaphroditus hadn't returned. Now, if you're a Philippian, you just can't just call him up and go, hey, Epaphroditus, what's going on, dude? Everything okay? He got really ill. Paul says actually he got so sick that we thought he was going to die. It was really, really bad. So that's why he didn't return. Well, somehow or other, a message has got back to the Philippians to say, hey, look, this is what's happened with Epaphroditus. And so now they've written another letter following up the offering saying, all right, now we're really concerned, is he okay? And so at that point, Paul says, and by that point as well, the Epaphroditus seems to have recovered. And so obviously a few months has gone by here. Paul says, all right, so look, I'm writing to say Epaphroditus is okay, and in fact, I'm sending him back with the letter. So Epaphroditus brings this letter back to the Philippians by way of saying, hey, I'm okay, here I am, look, in the flesh. And here's a letter from Paul, primarily to thank you for the offering. Now, of course, Paul's going to say other things to them, because this may be the last thing he says to them, or at least one of the last things he says to them. He just doesn't know what's about to happen. I mean, here's the point. Paul's in prison, waiting to stand on trial before Nero. If Nero has a bad day, Paul's as good as gone. I mean, he could be dead tomorrow. This is the reality for Paul right now. For that 2 years that he's in prison, he's pretty confident that he'll get off, but it may not happen that way. He could be dead that afternoon. If Nero says, you know what, no, you're one of those Christian troublemakers, that's it, you're gone. There wouldn't be any time between that decision and gone, head cut off. So Paul writes to the Philippians, and there's a bit of a sense of, hey, this could be the last thing you hear from him. So let me So this is where we find our letter to the Thessalonians, and really just what it's all about. Just, you know what, it's a tough situation, but thank you for your support, and just let me encourage you before I might say goodbye. And we'll look into the next video. So Paul writes to the Philippians to say thank you. He's sending back Epaphroditus, who initially brought over some support for Paul while he was in prison. And so he sends back this letter, and it's one of those, there is a sense of, this could be the last thing I say to you. So, let me just sort of give you some parting words. Let me thank you for the offering. And I did hear there's some issues going on, so we'll deal with that while we're talking. But primarily, it's just let me just encourage you guys. And, it's a letter of friendship, really, is what it comes down to. These people have been his friends for a very long time. They've been with him through thick and thin. And now in his worst possible situation where others have abandoned him, Paul says, you guys have continually come through. You're true friends. And so that's the sense we get from this. There's so much love in his letter. There's so much relationship and friendship in this letter, because it's precisely what it is. It's a letter from a friend to another friend. Just, you're an old buddy, and let me just reaffirm just how much I love you. So he starts out, and he says, look, let me just explain what's going on, right? Just give you an update on my situation, because he's in prison, and it's not the best. He's not in a good situation. He starts off by saying, look, first and foremost, I never stop thinking about you. Which is, of course, you're going to say that to a friend, someone you love, because he probably doesn't stop thinking about them. And, all this, an offering turns up, and Epaphroditus turns up, and he's like, oh, man, these guys are amazing. So I never stop thinking about you. But Paul is, he had a bad time when he wrote 2 Corinthians, but even in the midst of all of that, he really is an optimist. He's able to see the God in any situation. He says, you know what? Yeah, I'm in prison, but you know what the cool thing is? The prison guards get to hear the gospel. Whether they want to hear it or not, they get to hear it. Because even as Paul's writing these letters out, he's got this Roman guards literally chained to him, who has to hear and has to, people are coming in and having conversations with Paul. They're getting to hear the gospel. And it wouldn't be the same guard all the time. There would be other guards coming in, different guards looking after him through the time. So the whole, and the particular guard that we're talking about here, is the emperor's personal army. It's the emperor's personal guard that are looking after him. And so they're probably on a rotation of watching Paul 24/7. So every time somebody comes in to have a conversation with him, every time he writes a letter, they're hearing the gospel. And Paul's like, that's only 1 degree of separation away from the emperor. So this is a pretty good place to be. I may not get a chance to preach to the emperor himself. I may not, I don't know. But these guys get to hear it, and they're only 1 degree of separation from Nero. So, got lemons, make some lemonade. This is a pretty good situation that I find myself in. So don't be too worried. God's got me where he wants me to be right now. In the meantime, as for you guys, keep going, keep doing what you're doing. There's not a lot of rebuke here. There's not a lot of correction that's needed. because they're doing the thing. The fact that they're still giving him support, this is a good church. This is a good heart in this church. And so he says, look, just don't forget where your citizenship lies. In Philippi, a city that is proud of its Roman citizenship. By virtue of being born a Philippian, you are born a Roman citizen. And you've got pride in that. You've got loyalty in that. Paul says, don't forget your real citizenship is in heaven. And that comes with its own set of obligations and its own priorities. That's your true citizenship. That's your eternal citizenship. In the midst of all of that, stay humble. Just stay humble. Have that as a default position for your ministry, for everything that you do. Be like Christ in everything that you do, because that's your best witness. Christ, who was God, became nothing, crucified, risen again. Do that. Be that. If it was good enough for Christ to humble himself, then it's good enough for you. So use that as a benchmark for everything that is going to happen. And he says, in the midst of all of this, stay pure, because in doing so, you will shine like stars in this dark, crooked, and warped generation. Be that. Be stars in what is a dark world. Be humble, be bright, shine with the glory of God. He says, I'll hopefully send Timothy to you to see how you're going. But here's Epaphroditus in the meantime. So Timothy, obviously, we're going to talk more about Timothy in the next topic. Timothy's a close friend of Paul, a key co-worker of Paul's. And the idea is to send Timothy along just to give him an update on Paul's situation, which would also suggest to us that Timothy is with Paul, helping to support him, maybe even doing some work, maybe out there helping in the Roman church. We don't know, but certainly Paul is there with him. Paul says, just look, hey, don't forget, just keep an eye out for the dogs. And what is he talking about dogs? Well, it's an ironic way of using the term, because that's how the Jews always refer to the Gentiles. Paul's saying, you know who the true dogs are? The real dogs are the Jews who are going out saying you've got to be circumcised. And we've spent a lot of time dealing with this, because this is what was Paul's hassle the whole time. These Jews that are saying, no, you have to be circumcised. No, you're the dogs, not the Gentiles. You're the ones that are outside the promise, not the Gentiles. So watch out for them. They're charlatans, that's all they are. They're trying to get you circumcised. They're just charlatans. You've got to just be on the lookout for them. Don't go anywhere near them. Paul even says, I used to be that way. I get their mindset. I understand where they're coming from, because I used to be that. And here's the thing to remember. All of Paul's opponents, they were his contemporaries. Paul says to the Galatians, in my Jewish education, I advanced beyond all of my peers. Who are these opponents? Well, in a large part, they're going to be those same people, those peers with whom he grew up with in Jerusalem. So he knows who these people are. Paul says, I advanced beyond all of them in my training. And then I got to this point where I realized it's all rubbish. It's not that being Jewish is rubbish, but if that's what I'm relying on to become the people of God, then I've got nothing. It's only about Christ. And so Paul says, all I've got left to do now, it's not about me anymore. All I can do is I've got Christ as my goal, and I'm just going to run after him as hard as I possibly can. So if I can only leave you with his last encouragement, follow my example. See how I run after Christ? You do the same. Because he is the only thing that matters. If that's the last altar call I can ever give you, there's Christ, he's the goal, I'm running after him, you come along with me. And finally, just rejoice. Rejoice. Rejoice in the things that are good. Rejoice in the things that are beautiful. Find the things of God and just rejoice in those. Enjoy God. Finally, thanks for the gift. You thought I might have forgotten. I didn't forget. And this is just good rhetoric, really. You save the best for last. You want the last thing that if this is the last thing that they're going to hear from Paul, it's this. Thank you for your support. Thank you. I'm not going to thank you right at the beginning and then hopefully, maybe it gets lost in the message. No, this is the last thing you're going to hear. Paul says, God's taught me how to trust him in all circumstances. He's taught me how to live with plenty. He's taught me how to live with nothing. I've learned to be fully dependent on God. And what I've also learned is that God uses others to bless and to support. And that was you. So thank you for doing the will of God. Thank you for being there for me this whole time. Even though it's God ultimately determining it, it was God that put you in my life and put me in your life. And it's God that continually brings us together. So ultimately, this is his gift. And so I praise him for that. But I thank you for being those willing participants and that willing vessel that God is using in order to bless my ministry. Because at the end of the day, all of this comes back to God and to his plans and to his goodness. So thank you. Thank you for your faithfulness. And thank you for its manifestation in continuing this support that I'm now living off because I had nothing else. So this is a fantastic letter. I mean, what a church to strive to become like. I mean, what a fantastically beautiful. The news isn't so good for some of the other churches, and that's what we're going to get to, however, with the rest of these prison epistles. Let's see that. So we have two other letters amongst this pile of prison epistles, three in fact, in there, that are all addressed to the region of Asia Minor. So coming back to our story of Paul's missionary journeys, if you remember Paul's third missionary journey, he based himself in Ephesus for a couple of years and he sent church planters out. Well, now he's writing to those churches. And certainly in the case of Colossians, it's actually not his church. Well, in a sense it is. It's the second generation from him. But he's never actually been there himself. It's just kind of come out from him, like kind of like a church plant out of the main hub or whatever, however you want to put that. So these churches were started ultimately by Paul, but through his trained missionaries. So to give it a little bit more detail, just give you a sense of where all these churches actually fit in. These should be mostly familiar names to you because they're all the churches that we read about in Revelation. Ephesus, Laodicea, Colossae, Hierapolis, Philadelphia, Pergamum. You can still go and visit these places today. Come and do the New Testament Greece, Turkey trip with us, and we'll go to these places. You'll notice that there's a group of three cities there: Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae. They're all very close together. In fact, you can stand in Hierapolis and look out and see Laodicea, and you can see where Colossae is. Distance away, but they're quite geographically close. But the point is that all of these are major cities in Asia Minor, are all part of sort of the main trade routes going through Asia Minor, very old cities, very well-established cities. And as with all of Paul's practice, these are the places where you want to establish congregations because there's always passing traffic coming through. This is where all the action is happening. So very naturally, Paul's going to get as many churches as he can set up in those cities. Now, we read a little bit about what happened when Paul was in Ephesus. And it's very interesting what Luke emphasizes in his narrative. I mean, he can't tell the whole story, but he picks out some of the key stories that did happen that really give you a sense of what this place was actually like. And one of the famous stories is that this mob, this huge riot that takes place, where everyone's chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Now, what's happened there is that Paul's out preaching Jesus, and all these churches have been planted everywhere, and it's becoming quite a problem because people are starting to notice that there's less business happening at the Temple of Artemis. Now, what was the Temple of Artemis all about? Well, you've got a picture of it here. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it was the gateway to Asia. Ephesus was the capital of Asia Minor. This is their patron goddess. And really, this is the primary cult of the region. Right? This is preeminent. And that temple is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It would have been a spectacular, spectacular temple. And what people used to do is they'd have pilgrimages to Ephesus, and they would come to Ephesus and they would buy these little silver shrines of Artemis, and then they would go and leave them as an offering to Artemis in the temple. Now, the people that made those had a good business because people from all over the world are coming to Ephesus in order to pay homage to her. And what we read about is a guy by the name of Demetrius, who was a silversmith who made these shrines. And he gathered together all of the metal workers, all of the silversmiths in the region. Now, remember we talked about associations. The associations were like trade guilds, right? Everybody of the same trade would come together and they would have a community together. So he gathers all these people together and he says, this Paul guy, he's out there preaching this Jesus and it's diminishing the glory of Artemis. What he really means to say is that it's actually diminishing our business. It's really undercutting us because people are rejecting Artemis and they're, worshipping Jesus. Now he sort of girds it in this very pious language of, the glory of Artemis is being diminished. But he starts this write-up, and there's this huge thing that begins, and everyone's yelling out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and they're all carrying on and all that. What their concern is in diminishing the glory of Artemis is that it's creating the perception that she's not as powerful as what we think she actually is. This particular temple was actually not just the religious or the cultic center of Asia Minor, it was also the center of their economics. The amount of wealth and gifts and donations that were coming into this temple made it far and away the wealthiest cult temple in that region. So much so that it actually became a bank. It actually became a place where you can go and get loans. And what that meant was, or the reason why that was, is because this God is so powerful that whatever money, whatever is kept in here is untouchable. The goddess protects all of this. But now if you're going to diminish the power of Artemis, what that's actually saying is that she's not powerful enough to protect our economy. She's not powerful enough to protect our well-being. And not just for Ephesus, but for all of Asia. It's kind of like if you get a rumour that a company might be going through some sort of transition, all of a sudden the stock prices change because there's fear, there's what's going to happen, we're going to lose our money. Let's get it all out as quickly as we possibly can. And so what they're afraid of is that very thing. If we diminish the value of Artemis, then it's going to have a direct impact on our economy. So it's a really big deal. This particular goddess, Artemis, you've got a picture over here, pretty ugly looking thing, lots of breasts on her to look after all the gods, because she's kind of like the mother of all the gods. She's a really big deal in the context of the Olympic gods. She's one of the main goddesses. Some of the titles around her were Saviour, Lord, Queen of the Cosmos. I mean, does this language sound at all familiar? She is so powerful because she is the Lord of Lords and all these great things. So now they're coming along and saying, hey, Jesus is actually all of those things, is a direct threat, not just to our main cult, but also to our economy. So this is a real problem, and this is what Paul faces. The other thing we find in Ephesus, or in this region of Asia Minor, is that it was the center for the practice of magic. Now, magic happened all over. There was a lot of superstition, what we would call it, supernatural beliefs. That was common in the ancient world, but it was really found a home in Ephesus and around Asia Minor. One of the things that you find in the ancient world is these curse tablets, just as by way of example of what magic looked like. And what you would do, you'd write a curse against somebody that they've hurt you, they've offended you, they've shamed you. So you write this curse to the gods of the underworld, and you would say things like, curse their genitals, or, curse their... Well, usually it was around the genitals, actually. It was always sort of focused on the one thing. And you write these nasty curses against them, and then you roll it, that's a lead sheet, you'd roll it up, you drive a nail through it, and you leave it somewhere around their house, maybe in a well, maybe in brickwork somewhere, and the idea of that was it was going to curse that particular person. The gods were going to curse that person. That was a very common belief. In fact, it was such a common belief that the emperors tried to shut down the practice of magic, because who knows how many people are out there putting curses on the emperor. So it's a big deal. And so there's a really big sort of practice of it going on in Ephesus. So much so, in fact, that we read about people that used to practice magic coming and destroying all of their scrolls, having come to the faith. So you put all of that together, and that's really interesting, because it gives us this impression in Ephesus and that whole region of, a society that has a real sense of the supernatural, a real sense of the underworld and the power of magic and the power of the gods. It's true for the whole world, but there seems to be a real emphasis on it in Ephesus and those regions. And so that actually makes a lot of sense when we come to the letters of Ephesians particularly, and also of Colossians, where Paul seems to be countering this idea that there's all of these great powers. What Paul is wanting to remind them of, actually, there's only one great power. We call him Jesus, and everything else is subservient to that. But we'll come back to that in the next video and we'll look at these letters. So the first two letters we're going to look at of these prisoners, there's only three more anyway. The only other one is Philemon. But we're going to look at Ephesians and Colossians. And we're going to actually look at them together because they're effectively the same letter. There's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of overlap, because it's largely dealing with the same issues. What was common in Ephesus was going to be true in Colossae and other places. Now, a couple of things we need to know about them. First of all, the letter to the Ephesians. The letter to the Ephesians was addressed to the Ephesians, but it was also addressed to all of the other churches around the region. It's what we call a circular letter. It's very, very generic. It doesn't seem to deal with any specific issues that are taking place in Ephesus. It seems to be dealing with something that's common to the whole region. And so what scholars have realized is that what Paul sent to in our letter to the Ephesians was meant to be passed around and sent to all of the churches. So we could actually probably imagine a number of copies of this letter were sent in a big bundle with this messenger. And the one to the Ephesians was written to the Ephesians, and the other one to the Laodiceans was written to the Laodiceans. It was the same letter that was going to be addressed to all of these different groups. The other one we have with us is Colossians. Now, this is specific to the Colossian church, but it still deals with a lot of the same issues that are going on in Ephesus. But what is different about it, what's unique about it, is that it seems to be dealing with a specific heresy that's cropping up in the Colossian church. So it's a letter to the whole congregation, but attached to this would have been another letter which is addressed to a specific situation separate to that, which is the letter to Philemon, because Philemon was a member of the Colossian church. So you've got to picture these letters bundled together with others, because Paul refers in Colossians to another letter that he wrote to the Laodiceans. So there's a whole bundle of letters that Paul's written to all of these churches that were going to be circled around and all sorts of things. So the first thing we'll look at before we deal with Colossians and Ephesians together is we'll just look at some of the specifics within Colossians. Now again, I'm going to get you guys just to go and read all these for yourself. I want to give you just some pointers to look for in these letters. But there is a specific issue that's going on in Colossians, and it appears to be some sort of heresy. Now, we don't know what the heresy is because Paul doesn't specifically say what it is. He doesn't call it by any particular name or outline exactly what it's about. But he gives us clues as to what it might have consisted of. And there's lots of different theories that have sort of come out of that. No one's really sure exactly what it was. But what's really interesting about the way that he addresses it is that he gives sort of indicators as to not just what some of his basic beliefs are, but how it came to be in the church in the first place. And it's really informative because what we see in it it's kind of like a framework for how to spot a heresy. You know, all these little factors that Paul draws out of it, one by itself isn't to say, well, that's a heresy, but when you put all these things together, you can get a bit of a sense of not just what it is, but how it can actually get a hold in a particular group. So he says in 2:4 that it deceived through fine-sounding arguments. How did it get a foothold? It was really well presented. It was smooth, it was glossy, it was articulate. It's that sort of snake oil salesman that just sounds so convincing, but is really just selling you poison. It's this sort of approach. And really, when you think about it, that's how we sort of buy into ideas. We're convinced because we're just engaged with the presentation. So the more articulate you can make it, the easier it is for people to buy into it. So it deceives not necessarily through its lies, but it deceives in its presentation and its wrapping. It says it's a hollow and deceptive philosophy. It's an idea, right? It's a different way of looking at things. It just happens to be hollow. It seems to be like this very deep and meaningful thing, but when you look inside, there's actually nothing in there. It's just a balloon. But it's a way of doing things, a way of looking at things. It's a philosophy. He says it's dependent on human traditions and the elemental spiritual forces of this world. In other words, it takes the focus off God. It puts the focus back on earthly things. It gets your eyes off the truth, which is God, and it makes you look at anything else but. Or maybe there's a God out there, but look at the demons. Look at the spirits. Look at all these other things that are going on behind the scenes. That's what you need to be worried about. That's the really scary stuff. And whatever you want to say about those things. But in focusing on that, you lose sight of God. Because God shines a light on all of that and you realize actually nothing compares to him. But if you can take your focus off that and get distracted by everything else and get afraid of all of these other things, now we've got a problem. It seemed to question the deity and supremacy of Christ. It didn't deny his existence, it just denied his power. And this is so significant when you think about some of the cults and some of the ideas that are out there. Yeah, Christ is cool and Christ is he's all right. Maybe he's even a God, but he's not the God. Yes, there's something godly about him, but he's not the one true God. And without naming names, there are whole denominations and whole groups that hold this view. Jesus is God, but not the true God. Notice what's happening here. You're gradually just pulling apart the foundation, which is Christ as God. You take this focus off God, you diminish its power. You don't even have to necessarily articulate what it is. You're just taking apart the core of what the Christian message is. Now, in this particular case, it was Jewish in origin, so it had a concern for circumcision and Sabbath. And those things seem to be clearly mentioned. Now, we've seen already that this is just part and parcel of all of the challenges that Paul's been facing this whole time, is this focus on circumcision. So it had some sort of origin in the synagogue. And you go, hang on a second. Weren't all of those Jewish people didn't all have the same belief? Didn't they all hold exactly the same values and it was like a cut and paste wherever you find a synagogue? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's the same as if you imagine going from one church, even one Pentecostal church to another Pentecostal church. You're going to find some differences and you're going to find some that are just flat out teaching heresy. I'm not saying that's your church, but you can assume that they're going to be out there. And so you spread this Jewish sort of community out there, and over hundreds of years, through assimilation and through just being part of a particular culture, other ideas are going to start to filter in. And so this has its origin in probably in the synagogue, but maybe it's people that have come out of the synagogue who are Jewish and who are still holding on to some values of that, but they've mixed it in with all of these other things that they've picked up in Colossae. It says that it's ascetic in practice, so it's insisting on abstinence from various foods and probably certain behaviors. It becomes about doing a ritual. And isn't this so true of some of these ideas that you get out there? It's not about the goodness and the supremacy of God. It's not about his grace and his ability to forgive us. It's about you have to do all of these things in order to be worthy, or whatever it is that you're trying to be. It's about you. It's about your efforts. It's about your ability. It's about what you need to do to meet Jesus halfway. Because he came this far, you've got to do the rest. That's not the gospel. That's not what Paul has just spent all of that time talking to the Romans and the Galatians about. And then it elevated the worship of angels and spiritual ecstasies. It put angels somewhere between people and God. You need them to get you the rest of the way. They're like an elevator to get you to God. But you can't do it without the angels. So you don't want to annoy the angels. Because if you get them offside, they won't help you. So it's putting all of these things in front of Christ. It's putting your own effort, it's putting angels, it's putting demons and principalities and all these other things that are part of this life, but it's elevating to a point where they stand between us and Christ. And even when we get to Christ, we've diminished him, somehow he stands between us and God. So really we're in a hopeless state. And so what Paul has to do in Ephesians and Colossians is to strip all of this away, particularly in Colossians, strip all of that away and get back to the heart of the message, which is that Christ is God, he is supreme, and that's Paul's message. So when we deal with Ephesians and Colossians, as I said, we're going to deal with them together, and we're going to look at the key themes that are running through them, the same themes you find in both of these letters. And what I've said already is that there's a particular heresy that's going on in Colossae, but you can imagine that in a region like that, it would be very easy for that to crop up in other churches. And so Paul deals with it somewhat specifically in Colossae, but he kind of generically deals with it in the letter to the Ephesians, which is going to go around to all the churches as well. Now you notice the way that he deals with it. He doesn't take the belief and then systematically dissect it and pull it all apart and make the argument null and void. He doesn't even really deal with the specific issue at all, in fact. What he does instead is he just goes, you know what? Here's truth. Here's the facts. And what you'll find when you look at the facts is that nothing else stacks up against them. So you can have all of these beliefs and you can buy into all of this stuff, but when you actually understand the truth, all of that is instantly exposed as a lie. So I don't even have to go into the detail of dealing with all of these things and getting into these long debates about all of that. It's a waste of time. Here's the truth. And the truth is this. Christ is supreme. That's it. That is the starting point of everything else we're going to do. Christ is supreme. And more than that, by grace, we are seated with him. We're redeemed by him. We're sealed by him. We're empowered by him. And we're blessed by him. He's done everything. He's brought us into the throne room. He's given us a place with him. And that's all we need to know. So everything else that is being preached at you is trying to put something between that and you. But in order for you to buy into that, you have to step out of that place that Christ has brought you into in the first place. Because you can't be in Christ and then still be trying to get to Christ through your own effort. It's either one or the other. So how about this? Rather than trying to explain to you why none of that works, how about I just tell you where you already are? That is with Christ. Seated with him, able to enjoy and to take part in everything that is Christ, who is God, who is supreme, who has defeated sin. That's all you need to know. Just remember truth. So, do we still want to have a heresy? Or do we want to just recognize what's actually true about us? Here's what Christ actually did. You think you need to do it all yourself. You think you need to have all of the answers and you need to do all of the work with some help from angels, and Christ is just sitting there, not quite God, arms folded, just going, well, come on then, I'm waiting. Here's what he did. He says, we were dead, lost in sin, separated from Christ, and deserving of wrath. That's where we were, and that's where many people still are. God, however, in his mercy and grace, redeemed us and gave us access to his riches. He did all the work. There is nothing left for us to do. We can't climb some ladder through all of our effort to somehow get up to God. It doesn't work. He came down to us, brought us up with him, seated us with him, and gave us all the blessings in Christ freely by his mercy and by his grace. That's all you need to know. Anything that says otherwise is a lie. How do you pick a heresy? Anything that challenges that core idea is a heresy. Straight up. There's nothing else for it. Paul says, what's my role in all of this? Well, I'm just a messenger of the mystery. He says, it's for all of these centuries, people knew God, or certainly the Jewish people believed and understood God, but they didn't quite know how he was going to do it. They knew about the promise, they just didn't know what it was going to look like. But now God has made it clear. The mystery has been revealed. He's shone light on it. It's Christ. That was always the promise. And that's what we need to recognize to come into that place of Christ, is to recognize that Jesus is the promise. That was always the mystery. We know that a Messiah is coming, we just don't know when. We don't know what he's going to look like. We don't know what he's going to do, how he's going to do it. But now we know. It's been revealed. There's no more mystery. There's no more secrets. There's no more, what's going on? It's done. It's revealed. The only question is, do you believe it? And if you do, and you accept it, then everything else that challenges that is a lie. It's a heresy. He says, all right, now with that in mind, by way of reminder, you live in Christ, you are in Christ. Live like that. Live a life that reflects your place in Christ rather than a life that is somehow thinking it can somehow try to get to Christ by its own effort. You're already there. So live it out. What does that look like? Well, firstly, build the body. Build the community. Build up your brothers and sisters. Use your gifts to build up others. Build this community of Christ that he has established to reveal the mystery to the rest of humanity. Leave behind your former life of sin. It's done away with. Stop trying to pick it up again and say, somehow by my effort, I need to work my way through this and deal with this myself. No, it's done. Leave it behind. Just put it all behind you. Rather, put on Christ. And he literally uses the analogy here of clothing. Take off this dirty, filthy rag called sin and put on these new robes of Christ. Walk around wearing the clothes of Christ. Everyone will be able to see whose you are because of what you wear. Demonstrate this in the way that you do family. Now, there's all people, this household code, and Paul's saying women need to submit, and husbands love, and all this sort of stuff. They get, so problematic. First of all, Paul says the best place to demonstrate how to do family, or the best place to demonstrate Christ is in the family. Why would he focus on the family? Well, because that's where church was. Church happened in people's dining rooms. It was literally built around a family. And so we've already seen in an ancient family, the male was the head. There was no question about it. He was almost God of that family, and then everybody else was subservient to him. Paul says that's how the world just does with the family. That's just the way things are. That's the status quo. But read between the lines of what Paul does. Go back and read those household codes, particularly in Ephesians, and notice what he does. He says, first to the wives, submit to your husbands. And the wives then going, yeah, of course, what else are we going to do? But then he addresses the husbands. First the wives, then the husbands. He subordinates the husband to the wife. Then he says to the children submit to your parents. Like, children obey parents. Of course. What else are they going to do? And then fathers, don't exasperate your children. Notice, first of all, that he addresses the children first. Then the fathers. But notice, too, that he addresses the children at all. We don't know really anything about ancient children because nobody paid attention to them. Paul addresses the children in this letter. First he addresses them, and then you go, well, that's a big deal because you don't ever address the children. But the more important thing, why are the children there? Children don't sit with the parents at a meal. That just doesn't happen in an ancient meal. There's no family sitting around the dinner every night. No, the children are off in another room, being children and separated from the adults. Why are they in the room? The fact is they're in the room. They're part of this family. And Paul then puts them above the father. Then he says to the slaves, we go, there were slaves. Of course there were slaves. Of course there were. That was just what that world was. But not only does he address the slaves before the masters, he addresses them at all. They're sitting at the table with everybody else. They're a slave sitting at the table. This is just radical. And the fact that he even acknowledges their presence, because slaves are meant to be in a back room and silent and they're almost invisible. They really are. That's the idea of a slave, is that they are invisible. Paul says, hey, slaves, you've got a role to play here as well. Just keep doing what you're doing. Finally, Paul says, in light of your place in Christ, recognize your spiritual authority. In a world that's thinking there's a demon under every rock and there's a curse behind every tree and there's an Artemis down the road who is ready to destroy all of us if we even sneeze in her direction. Paul says, in Christ you have all spiritual authority because all of those things have been defeated. Stand in that authority and everything else will suddenly be put into perspective. So it's good, really general advice. Ephesians, Colossians, it's good general advice to a region that, well, for them, this is the primary issue. And if this is going to be Paul's last words, he wants to remember this fact. You are in Christ, and Christ has done everything that needs to be done. And that's all you need to know. But there's one specific issue we need to deal with, and we'll come to that in the next video. So amongst Paul's pile of letters that he sent to Asia Minor was this just little gem. It's an incredible little letter that Paul writes here. It's addressed to one of the house church leaders, a guy by the name of Philemon, who apparently is a friend of Paul's. How they met, probably when Paul was in Ephesus, we guess. But what seems to have happened, he's one of the house church leaders in Colossae. And At some stage, one of his slaves, a guy by the name of Onesimus, has done something to displease him. Maybe broken some... So amongst Paul's pile of letters that he sent to Asia Minor was this just little gem. It's an incredible little letter that Paul writes here. It's addressed to one of the house church leaders, a guy by the name of Philemon, who apparently is a friend of Paul's. How they met, probably when Paul was in Ephesus, we guess. But what seems to have happened, he's one of the house church leaders in Colossae. And at some stage, one of his slaves, a guy by the name of Onesimus, has done something to displease him. Maybe broken some crockery or something. We just don't know what the situation was. In those situations, if there is a rift, now, if there's a matter of enmity between a master and a slave could actually make legal appeal to one of the friends of the masters to intercede on their behalf. Now, this particular slave, Onesimus, would have recognized or known that Paul was a good friend of Philemon. He probably would have spoken about him at some point. And so, knowing that this Paul was what we call in Latin an amicus domini, a friend of the master, he finds Paul, he tracks him down, and he then makes an appeal. He says, "Hey, Paul, can you write a letter for me? Can you stick up for me? Can you?" Paul, like, "Well, you notice something changed. You notice something risen. Can you write a letter for me? Can you do something?" In the meantime, however, Onesimus seems to have become a Christian. He seems to have had a conversion experience whilst he was with Paul, so much so that Paul's just been really impressed with his transformation. He's just really, wow, this is a good kid. Yeah, this is something we need to sort of take seriously. And so Paul then writes in response, and it's only a very short letter. We've talked about reading letters in their entirety. Well, this is an easy one to start with because you can read it in a few minutes. It's a very short letter. And again, let's pull together everything we've seen so far in terms of how we read these letters. Firstly, they're to be read as one whole thing, but they're to be read to an audience. They're to be read aloud and to be heard and to be performed. And so here is a letter written to Onesimus and the church that meets in his house. But what you have to imagine is that in the room as well is Onesimus. Onesimus has returned with these letters. He's now back in the house of Philemon, and here is an appeal that has been made by Paul on behalf of Onesimus. So that's the picture you have to have in your mind when this is being read aloud. Onesimus is there, Philemon's there, probably seated at a table. Philemon will be at the head of the table as the host, and everybody else will be gathered around hearing this appeal that's been made on behalf of this slave, who Philemon has every legal right to kill. That's just reality. He can very easily kill this slave for any and every reason, because it's his slave. For the same reason I can take a sledgehammer to my car. It's my car, I can do whatever I want with it. My slave, I can do whatever I want with it. So Paul has to make an appeal, but he has to tread lightly, because he can't offend Philemon. He can't embarrass him in front of the church. He needs to tread very carefully in the way that he does this, because he wants to move Philemon to a place where Philemon will act on his own behalf, not feel like he's being compelled, but whatever it is that Paul's trying to get Philemon to do, he needs to do it in such a way that he's in control of the situation. That's really important here. He can't be seen to be manipulated, because it's an honor-shame culture. If Philemon is to act, he needs to be seen to be acting according to his own will and volition, but in a way that maintains his honor. So Paul's got to tread a really difficult line here. There's lots of different ways that he can approach this, and there's all these different dynamics that are happening in the relationship that Paul needs to play on in order for this to happen. And this is what the letter is about. So when we come back in the next video, what we're going to look at is really one of the most clever short sermons you've probably ever hear. And really, really remarkable pastoral techniques that Paul is using here. Maybe not to be repeated necessarily, but certainly effective in what Paul does for the situation. So join me in the next video and we'll look at Philemon. So Paul's going to make an appeal for this runaway slave, or this slave who has had a falling out with his master. And he wants something to occur. Obviously he wants some sort of reconciliation. The last thing he wants is for this slave to be killed. He wants some sort of reconciliation. But he needs to do it in such a way that Philemon will be seen to be doing it from his own volition, not compelled, but at the same time to do what Paul wants him to do. Now that's a really tricky line to walk. And so Paul, he's getting pretty good at this by this stage. He's been doing ministry for a long time by now. And so he kind of pulls out all of his skills in the way that he addresses this letter. So you have to remember, this is addressed to a room full of people, and Onesimus is there, Philemon is at the head of the table, and everybody else is watching. It's almost like a trial of sorts. So he starts off and he addresses the letter to Philemon, but he also addresses it to Apphia, and to somebody named Archippus, and to the whole church that meets in your house. Now that's really clever. He's not just addressing Philemon. By addressing everybody, he's actually bringing all of them into the decision. They're all actually a part of this. He wants all of their attention focused on this situation. Now, who's Apphia? Well, Apphia would have been the wife of Philemon. Now, she's an important person to have here because as the woman, as the wife, she runs the house. And so actually, effectively, it was always the wife who looked after the slaves. So she has a large share in this decision. Whatever is about to happen, she is part of it. So he brings her into it. Archippus, we're not sure who that is, maybe one of the elders of the church, but everybody else is part of the decision. So now everybody's watching Philemon. They're all a part of this. They're doing this now as a community. And that's pushing the line. It's already pushing the line outside of the authority of Philemon, who's the head of that house. Right? It's making it a church issue rather than a personal issue. You see, because this is the thing, if it's a personal issue, it's a legal issue. If it's purely between Philemon and Onesimus, it is just a legal issue. And Philemon can do whatever he wants at that point. But Paul is subtly making this a church issue, which changes the whole dynamics of how this is going to play out. He then says, I've summarized it here, I'm always thinking about how much you love everyone in the church and how you refresh all of their hearts. You show your love by literally refreshing the hearts of the saints. And everybody you meet, you bring refreshment to them. In fact, one of the things that sustains me through my present ordeal is just how much you love. So he's setting Philemon up. He's praising Philemon as he should, as you do in every letter. You're always going to, say, except for the Galatians, but you're going to set them up as, hey, you're a great person. I'm thinking about you. He does it to the Philippians. He does it to everybody else. But what he points out specifically about Philemon is the love that he has that everybody knows. Philemon is famous for being a person who loves the body, who loves the church, and does so, expresses that in the way that he refreshes the hearts of the saints. He's calling out a certain aspect of Philemon's character that he wants to put on display. Everyone is now reminded and aware of the fact that this guy Philemon is a person who is renowned for being a person of love and refreshment. Brilliant. He's completely set up, and this is what's now expected of him. He says, now I could play the apostle and demand that you do this, but I'd rather just appeal as a broken old man that I've become. I'm an apostle. As we find out, your coming to the faith was because of my apostleship. In fact, this whole Colossian church came about because of my apostleship. So I'm a pretty big deal, and I could just put the pressure on you and say, I'm an apostle, do what I tell you to do. But I won't. But you notice what he just did. He did it anyway. I could say I'm an apostle, but I won't. The very fact that he mentioned that he's an apostle and he could draw in his apostleship is drawing on that authority. But I'm not going to do it. But you just did. Oh, yeah, I did. Oh, well, too bad. Then he says, but no, well, what I'd rather do is paint a picture for you of what my situation is like in prison. I'm a broken old man in chains. And so now you got a picture. Whoever is reading this letter out would have been imitating a broken old man in chains in prison. So now we've gone from apostle, who we know that's about Paul, to broken old man in chains in prison, making an appeal as a desperate old man. Well, both of those people you're going to listen to, right? And you kind of got both of those now standing in front of you in this appeal. I mean, Philemon is just backed into a corner here. It's really quite amazing. Paul says, whilst he was in prison, this young Onesimus became my son. Moreover, he actually became really useful to me while he was here. Now, if he's useful to me, how much more useful could he be to you? So here he is, refresher of hearts. Here is my son, my heart. Amazing. There's Onesimus right there. My son, right? He became my son whilst I was in prison. Useful to me, even more useful to you. You're a refresher of hearts. We've just acknowledged that. Here's my heart. What are you going to do with it? Amazing. Paul says, I wanted to keep him around, as a representative of your support for me, but I didn't want to do anything without your consent. See, Paul's kind of like twisting the knife a little bit here. You, Philemon, I thought we were friends, right? I thought we had something going on here. I've been in jail now for quite some time, and I haven't heard a word from you. Then all of a sudden, Onesimus turns up, and I'm thinking to myself, maybe this is Philemon's help. Maybe Philemon can't get here, so now I've got this slave over here who's helping me on Philemon's behalf, because that's what friends do, isn't it? Right, Philemon? They help each other. You hadn't helped me, but now suddenly this help turns up on my prison door. Isn't that funny? Maybe all along, he was here as a token of your support. Now, of course, Philemon's sitting there going, I guess I kind of haven't got around to sending you support yet, Paul. Paul says, come to think of it, maybe God actually sent him. Maybe God took him from you to give to me for a short time, so that when he comes back, you could see him as in a new light. No longer as a slave, but as a brother. So maybe all along, this was God's plan. So do what you like, Philemon, but understand that perhaps actually this is the plan of God. So what are you going to do about that, you refresher of hearts here? And finally, if you consider me your partner, if you really do value this friendship, treat him as you would me. You refresher of hearts here. If we're friends, that's my son. Treat him as you would me. Treat him as a brother. Now, what has he just done? That's my son. He's your brother. So by virtue of that, I'm now your father as well. You didn't hear me say it, but it's implied in what I said. So now, boys, you need to make up. You, older brother, need to treat him like your younger brother. I'm not telling you what to do, but treat him like a brother. If he's cost you anything, now let's get back to the real issue, of course, here is that he's done something to offend you. If he has done something that's cost you, I grant you that. Clearly, something has happened between the two of you that's caused offense. If he's cost you anything, I will repay it. Mark my words, I'll repay it. Now, I don't have any money, so how about you take it out of what you owe me for your salvation? I'm sure that's going to have something left over. I mean, you came to Christ as a result of my ministry, so you've got everything because of me, so you actually owe me everything, so maybe just take this out of that. That should make it even. Oh, and do me a favor, just in case you haven't been clear. Do me really big favor. Refresh my heart, because that's what you're famous for. Refresh my heart. Hang on, which heart are you talking about, Paul? Your heart or Onesimus? You decide. Refresh my heart by refreshing my heart. Refresh my heart so that you can refresh my heart. Whichever way you want to take it, refresh my heart, because that's what you're famous for. But I'm sure you're already planning to anyway. I'm sure already, you know what, you're a good guy, man. You're a refresher of hearts. You've already got this under control. Oh, and in other news, just before I forget, I'll be coming to stay with you soon. Planning to get out of jail, very confident I'm going to get out of here, and as soon as I do, I'm going to come and visit you, Philemon, because I know you've been praying for this. You've been praying all this time that I'll come back to visit you. I know those prayers, God's told me, so I'm coming back. So you're welcome, Philemon. I'll see you soon. And of course, this will all have been cleared up by the time I return to you. Now, here's a couple of questions. Firstly, did it work? Well, the main question is, did it work? Well, the fact is, we actually don't know what Paul's asking him to do. He never actually explicitly states, this is what I want you to do. He just assumes that everybody knows. Now, is he expecting that Philemon would free his slave? Maybe. But he never actually says that. All he says is, you know what to do, you'll do the right thing, because you're an awesome guy. But did it work? Well, the fact that we have the letter would suggest that it did. Because if Philemon rejected this request, he would have torn that letter up and you would never have heard about it again. The fact that we have this letter would indicate to us that yes, in fact, it did actually work. But of course, it's just speculation. Anyway, I've gone over time. So that's the prison epistles. Again, go away with them, take this framework, read them all together. Really incredible, very encouraging, amazing letters. And join me in the next class when we talk about the pastoral epistles. I'll see you for that.